I've worn many hats in my career, with sports always as the through line, and venture capital. They can go out and privately finance new arenas. Most owners today who are pursuing this or who have pursued it, right, they're looking at it as a long-term asset. How could this be something I give to the next generation or my kids' kids?
Hello and welcome to the Sports Pundit podcast, the show for people shaping the future of sport. Driven by my curiosity working in the industry, I've brought together leading executives to host conversations with decision makers across innovation, marketing, media, finance, and performance, unpacking their strategies and industry-shaping ideas.
So, Tim, you've had a fascinating career. It's been, both a combination of sports, real estate, becoming intertwined. You and I met about 2 years ago at the Global Sports Leadership Summit in Barcelona, and I was struck by your experience. Co-founding Global Sports Venture Studio with LA Dodgers, helping to lead creation of Overtime Elite and Overtime Arena, and now building up the sports and entertainment practice at Transwestern. So what's been interesting is that your journey really mirrors the broader trend we see real estate, where that's becoming a really important part of sport as an asset class. Teams used to be about prestige, winning games, but now we're really talking about IRRs, mixed use development, billion-dollar infrastructure investment. So maybe we start with your time at Overtime Elite in the arena, because I think that shows how sports facilities are evolving. So we would dive right into that first and just tell us, what did you learn? How did that lead you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. Excited to catch up and always fun to connect with you. So, you alluded to the Global Sports Venture Studio as well, and then my time with Overtime. And I've worn many hats in my career, with sports always as the through line, and venture capital was something I was really focused on with a micro fund I had created called TAC Ventures, focused on sports media entertainment. And I bring that up because I launched that in 2015, kind of before this wave of venture funds in sports. And to your point, real estate's now experiencing the same attention that maybe 10 years ago was on venture as it relates to sports. And I think that's a great signal for how the asset class has evolved. And to your point about what team owners, more sophisticated owners, are focused on in terms of how they can maximize the value of your team asset. Specific to Overtime, I could spend hours talking about what an incredible company that is, what an incredible experience it was working directly with Dan Porter and Zach Wiener, the founders of Overtime. But we started Overtime Elite as an idea. Similarly, this was before a lot of new leagues have come about. It seems like every day now there's like a new emerging sports league. But what was so unique about Overtime was their huge reach and audience that they had built, which we really believed was the foundation for what could look like a successful league. So I'll spare you the details on a long-winded answer about everything that went into Overtime Elite and its plan and strategy. But, we raised $80 million, and we had a sense of what we wanted the Overtime Elite to look like, at least on social media and on the internet. But there was this existential question of, where are we going to do this, and how are we going to do it? So we did a market-wide search. I was actually a client of Transwestern, where I'm at now, at the time. And we ultimately centered on Atlanta, given everything that happens there from a sports entertainment standpoint, the culture that's there. Thought that would resonate really well with the families that would be putting their athletes through the program. And created this unbelievable production facility meets arena and state-of-the-art training facility that continues to evolve as OTE's model evolves and Overtime's business model evolves.
That's amazing. So how much of your client experience from Overtime then transferred over to Transwestern, where now you're looking at a much broader scale?
Yeah. What was so amazing about that project is we built a 100,000 square foot arena, training facility, and production studio and school in about 6 months, which with everything I know now, maybe wouldn't have believed it was possible to achieve. And it was during the height of COVID. So that definitely laid the groundwork and the foundation for me to make the pivot from venture capital in sports into real estate in sports, seeing where the trends were headed, but really only a company as innovative and exciting as Overtime would probably be willing to take a risk and a bet on, me helping develop a facility like that. And there's nothing better or more fulfilling, at least in what I do now, than to be able to point at something in the real world, in the built environment, and say, I contributed to that, or my team helped create that. And that's what I found so fulfilling about this space. And coming out of that project, to your question, there was just a ton of inbound interest, right? Like even around the conversation we're having now. How did you do that? What did it cost? What was the strategic plan? And now with all of the both new leagues that are emerging, but then also the growth of women's sports, it's been a great opportunity for us as we build our practice at Transwestern to really get creative and think, what does the future of sport look like? How do facilities and infrastructure live and breathe with that? And in plugging in the Transwestern platform, the whole other opportunity as it relates to mixed use development, advising on things like sponsorship, working through the most complex lease agreements, you can imagine with larger format arenas and operators. So we've really been able to use the Overtime project as a springboard, where I was a client to Transwestern, to now build out a sports and entertainment practice, 5 years later, that we're really proud of.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was reading this white paper that came out, I think, a couple days ago, Clutch Sports and RBC. And they were talking about how traditional revenue stream, media rights, sponsorship, ticketing are pretty mature to a certain extent, right? And it's priced into the team valuation. So does that mean that actually stadium and multi-purpose stadium development in these districts, is that the next kind of growth trajectory when we're looking at sports?
Yeah, well, I certainly believe it is. And I think there's two kind of key things at play here. There's the stadium component, and then there's the opportunity for mixed use development. And the two are very different. If you look back 5-10 years ago and beyond, almost every single stadium was 100% publicly funded. The advent of privately financed stadiums is pretty new relative to the history of sport. And that's because sports has hit an escape velocity where you can actually go and underwrite things like premium seating, suites, sponsorship. There's a whole there's this known information, but also the teams have gotten so much more sophisticated, and the fans have been willing, and the brands have been willing to put more money, spend more money on their favorite teams. And like the biggest example of kind of that shift is Chase Center in San Francisco with the Warriors and what they created and opened in 2019. San Francisco, especially Silicon Valley, with the success of the Warriors at that time, created such a unique environment that they were able to privately finance, a $2 billion plus arena with confidence because of all of the historical data, but then also just what they were forecasting from like a ticketing and premium standpoint. And then more recently, you've also had players like Oakview Group, who aren't even a team owner per se, but also have created a model where they can go out and privately finance new arenas with, often team driven, but even more of a model around like concert revenue and premium seating around that. So you have the stadium component on one side where that's changed, and a lot of it tied to the premium inventory and sponsorship piece that can allow for more dollars going towards those projects. But then you have the mixed use piece where, and this ties to that RBC report, teams have maximized or optimized their core streams of sponsorship, ticketing, live rights, and licensing or in merchandise. And so they're kind of looking around and saying, how else do I optimize this IP value of 2 billion, 5 billion, 8 billion, 10 billion into other ways? Or how do I leverage my relationship as a key stakeholder in the city and like this modern town hall we've created through sporting events, like kind of one of the last places where so many people get together, and that facilitates opportunities on the real estate side to do a public-private partnership where you can get land at a rate that underwrites, or you can get other public subsidies that start to make sense, so that from a real estate fundamental standpoint, you can actually go and do development either independently, which is what we've seen a lot of to this point, or working with an outside developer like a Transwestern to go and take on these big projects.
Yeah, when I was doing research for this, I kind of outsourced out some questions to people in the industry. And I think one of the biggest questions people have is who's funding it, right? Like, we're starting to touch this. Who's actually funding it? Let's just focus on the US. Who's funding these projects? What's the optimal way to get financing, and the structure, to your point, between these public versus privately funded? Because see things also like Intuit Dome, where one person is kind of bankrolling the entire thing. Like, is that the model? Is what you're saying in terms of, Oakview coming in? Like, how do we go about this? I think it's a very niche, knowledge, and people want to know.
Again, I think it's important to look at those two channels of, the arena stadium component and then the mixed use component. And really, they don't always go hand in hand, although oftentimes there'll be promise of a mixed use development where tax revenues can help pay for the public improvements that lead to the stadium. But if you look at the projects that have actually been delivered with mixed use, almost across the board, it's ownership groups that have a history or direct experience in real estate development up until this point, right? So you see that with what the Rams have done with SoFi, that's Stan Kroenke's group, and now what they're doing around their training facility. You've got the Star in Frisco with the Jones family and what they were able to develop there. That was, I think, with Lincoln as well, who's more of a bona fide, big time developer. And then you look at the Battery, and that one was unique, but it was all team driven, where the team got really creative with financing to be able to put together that whole development around the baseball stadium. What's starting to shift a bit is because of all the interest in sport, and not just like the valuation or monetary value of these teams, but how much interest they drive and how important they are to the cities that they're in. You are now starting to see other development groups get involved. And again, that's why that's one of the things we're focused on with our practice is how do we take our development company, which has delivered over $10 billion worth of development across many different asset types, and play a role in partnership with team owners to create something really special that's endemic to the market, that they're in. Their fans are so important. They would never want to do anything to jeopardize that game day experience and also the city that they're in. So you have to be very market specific as you look at any of these opportunities. I don't think there's like a one size fits all approach to any of these projects. They're all very complex and they all take a long time.
Yeah, and I'm assuming different sports require very different setup in terms of their season, their timing, the playoffs, and all that stuff too, right? I was looking at...
It's a great call out. Yeah, I think that's another thing. That's another nuance that gets lost, where you can make you can point to, again, the Battery with the Braves, and maybe you're like an arena-based team, like an NBA or an NHL team, and say, oh, I want the Battery. Well, there's a lot different dynamics between being in the summer and being in the winter, and then even more so depending on what market you're in, right? There's different dynamics between, quite frankly, how nice it is to look at an open air baseball stadium when it's not being used versus the outside of an arena, and like that stuff's important. I think what often gets lost is this idea that most of us experience sports venues during an event. And so it's kind of like the story when you and a friend, I'm sure we've all experienced this, you like go to a coffee shop or you go to a bar or restaurant, you're like, oh my gosh, this place must just make so much money, right? And then like a month later, you find out it closed. You're like, how did it close? Well, it's like, okay, well, you were there on a Friday night. Like the ingredients were too expensive. It wasn't run well. Like they're paying staff too much, whatever it was. But it's easy to get caught up in that notion of like, oh, wow, like I'm at a NBA finals game and there's 10,000 people outside. It's like, well, okay, that could be like a 1 in 10 year, 15-year event. What does this actually look like? The 200 or 250 days a year where there's nothing going on, or even during the day when there's an event at night. So you have to like contemplate all these different factors to ultimately try and deliver something that makes sense from just a pure real estate fundamental standpoint.
Yeah. It's the NFL teams play like 10s to 15 game a year, right? But the stadiums are massive and the investment they're going in. So you're touching on like the rest of the year. Like how do people fill that? Or how do you go about even at the design phase assessing what's feasible?
Yeah, it's like a double dose. Like not only are there way less events, but also the footprint of the stadiums are so much larger.
Yeah.
So how does that integrate into like more of a mixed use master plan, and how do you justify that? Again, I think in those cases, especially, it's about using the stadium as a catalyst for what else can exist around it. And, it's art and science, I would say. And there's no one size fits all plan where how do you accommodate, 60, 70, 80,000 fans coming in and out of a stadium 10 times a year, or with concerts, maybe 25 times a year, and also still make it a pleasant experience for the housing you're building there, the office you're building there, the retail. So that's why I like to use the term a lot more of adjacent mixed use, venue adjacent versus venue anchored. I mean, the venue's still the anchor, but you can't be so tied to it that you're just creating a miserable experience for both fans or residents. But the other trend you're seeing is almost universally across the board with new NFL stadiums, with maybe Buffalo being the exception, is they're domed, right? So you've got Washington, Nashville, Las Vegas, SoFi, and that's very, very intentional so that you can position yourself to host Final Fours, Super Bowls, concerts, other events. And then they're also being paired with smaller capacity concert venues, right? So at SoFi, you have the YouTube Theater. You've seen, just an article today about how AEG and Live Nation are building 3,000 to 5,000 to 7,000 cap concert venues all over the country, and those are often used as a complement. So now you can you can benefit from all like that parking and access infrastructure, but now you're introducing another maybe 150 or 100 events in a calendar year, which just increases that activity.
Yeah. AEG is doing one in Bangkok, actually. They're putting up an arena more, but on top of a giant mall, which is going to be quite interesting in how that gets balanced out.
Yeah, that's pretty creative. I mean, I imagine it's tied directly to how expensive land is and how hard it is to, develop an arena or a concert venue. And like the other just like physical limitation is you can't really go vertical on top of an arena or a concert. Concert venue can integrate a little bit more, but it's cost prohibitive because of that. You can't have a large pole or support, being right in the middle of the viewing experience. And so, to create the structural steel that would be required to support vertical development above that just doesn't make any financial sense. So that's why sometimes you'll see it maybe on the top of a development, but then how are you getting fans
up? Yeah, that's interesting. Is there kind of a best practice in terms of looking at mixed use or the adjacent versus actual team and media revenue to make a project successful, or it just entirely depends on settings, market, sports, context?
I would say it really comes down to the ownership group and what their appetite is for both investment and hold period and control. So most most owners today who are pursuing this or who have pursued it, right, they're looking at it as a long-term asset, just like their team asset. And how could this be something I give to the next generation or my kids' kids? Which, by the way, is a pretty great way to be able to approach real estate. We talk a little bit about like be long-term greedy because that's how you accrue value.
Yeah.
But when you're starting to have a need for capital, outside capital, that obviously changes the equation, both in terms of potential control for the development and also just when an investor is going to expect to be able to get their money out. And I think that's probably the biggest reason you haven't necessarily seen as much outside investment yet to these types of, adjacent developments, because there's a little bit of conflict there. And quite frankly, that's why we've set up our sports entertainment practice at Transwestern, because we're able to toe the line between what our development company and maybe outside investors might have from an expectation standpoint on capital, hold period and return expectations, as well as control for the project, with what a team owner's desires are, or what a municipality's desires might be for a project. And we kind of almost operate as a translator to try and make that work. That's what I get the most excited about, because I feel like we've got, the bona fide development experience with an understanding of, what an ownership group or team leadership is really looking to do.
This podcast is produced by O6, but more than just being a production partner, they're also active members of the Sports Pundit community. Having seen the work they're doing across the industry up close, working with leading F1 teams and Premier League clubs, as well as top creators, I'm so delighted to now have them on board and helping to elevate this show to a new level.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So you touched a little bit about structures in a way, because, your investment objective, exit timeline. I look to Fenway Sports, MSG. A lot of times when people talk about facilities, is that the way to go, is to separate out kind of a real estate co versus having teams and then having like an F&B type? Like, what is that the best practice in the market today?
Sure. Well, specific to arenas, the reality is the box, no matter how nice it is, could be a $200 million box or a $4 billion box. But, the arena, that's really a means to revenue. And where the revenue is really captured is through the operator, or through an operating agreement that a team may have with someone who's actually operating, the F&B, the Oakview Groups of the world, ASM. On the F&B side, you've got, Levy Restaurants, Delaware North. And so depending on how sophisticated a team's ownership group is, or how much they want to invest in those dedicated resources to actually go and operate, ultimately determines what that relationship looks like with whoever that third-party operator was. But at the end of the day, that operating entity, whether it's just the team or it's the team with a third party, that's really where the revenue is generated. And the box itself is a means to that end. And that's an important thing to understand, because that has implications if it's a privately funded arena, but it also has implications if it's more publicly financed. Specific to the mixed use real estate side, that makeup's a lot different. And I think you can point to the Braves, how their real estate assets have been essentially carved out or treated separately. It is all, I think the important thing to remember is it's all new dollars that have to go to that are risk on to do development. Like, there's no guarantee that the development's going to perform well. It's very easy to see something that's successful, like the Battery on All-Star Weekend, and say, oh, well, they're making so much money, and other groups should be able to participate in this. It was but they had to go through so many different hurdles, and I don't want to speak as if I was a part of that project. This is more just kind of hearing over the years, but the amount of hurdles they had to go through to get that project financed, right, in a really unique way. It proves out why they're now experiencing the benefit from that, because they took a really big risk in doing that. So I think like just understanding there is real inherent risk with these deals helps kind of better, I guess, reconcile, where ultimately the returns go.
Yeah. What are the time horizons that you see people expect?
Well, like I said, with ownership groups, the expectation is a longer hold and not really any interest in trying to identify when they might exit. Instead, they're trying to focus on generating, new revenue streams that sit outside the team and are tied to the capital they're putting into the real estate development. In the investment community, I mean, it can vary. So a more conventional approach is you would, take a piece of dirt, entitle it for a ton of development, and then sell it off. And then another group would come in and maybe take an individual parcel within that site plan, and it's a hotel here, it's a multifamily building here. There's specialized capital around each of those product types. And then from there, they'll have different hold periods. Some merchant builders are really looking to just build a multifamily, sell it, and move on. Others would say, we have a whole asset management company, we'll deliver the multifamily building, we'll stabilize it in 2 years, and then we'll optimize its operational model, and in 5 years we'll look, so a total of 7 to 10 years we'll look to exit. So it really just kind of depends on, a lot of things, like what your cost basis is for the land, where your capital is coming from, like a family office versus an institutional fund, and then whether or not a group's actually playing that role to go vertical, as they say, come out of the ground and actually build the buildings, or if they're really just trying to play that front end role in pre-development to get everything entitled and approved, which inherently increases the land value, but doesn't require the same risk to actually go and build and deliver the buildings.
Yeah. Fascinating. Women's sports. We touched on that a little bit at the start. Kansas City is like blowing up on my Instagram all the time. I know they're putting in 117 million, 120 million investment into building out the stadium. Is that the trend we can expect in women's sports? Is that proving out?
That's just a phenomenal project, and kudos to the Long family and everybody involved with that. I know Marquee Development's been involved and who's gotten around that. I think it's just an incredible project, and just shows what's possible. I get really excited about female first stadiums, that can be anchored by women's team, and that's really kind of the first one. The Dallas Wings will be moving into the renovated Coliseum here in the next few years, and they'll be the anchor for that in Dallas. And I think there's others on the horizon. I love women's sports. I'm excited, most excited, I think, about there finally being enough media attention that the teams and the athletes are getting the credit they deserve. And as a result, the owners, or I shouldn't say the owners, but these teams have felt the need to really invest and deliver world-class facilities and amenities for their athletes. So we've been directly involved in delivering the Phoenix Mercury's new state-of-the-art training facility, which was in tandem with a new headquarters for the business operations of the Phoenix Suns and Player 15 group. That was an incredible $100 million plus project that we delivered and opened during WNBA All-Star last year. And we've since been engaged by 2 other WNBA teams, which we're excited about. Some information will be tied to those, pretty soon here. Really with, providing the types of facilities that these athletes deserve. And, it's kind of interesting, not to go down the rabbit hole of NIL. You probably can't have a conversation these days without NIL coming up, but prior to NIL, all those dollars were really being invested in facilities, because that's how you would differentiate at the college level, with recruits. And in some ways, there's now like almost this inverse thing happening at the professional level with women's sports, where teams are trying to differentiate through their facilities. And I think in that sense, more is more. And with what we were able to accomplish with the Mercury and deliver there, it's really helped set the bar, for what's possible in women's sports training facilities.
Yeah. What makes it different? What makes a women's sport facility different than the men's?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation because, especially me, just being a white guy, like, white dad living in Brooklyn with 3 kids, it's like, oh yeah, certainly it's like pink bathrooms and like unicorns. It's like, well, no, of course not. There are hygiene components that are, get very detailed and specific on, where people with much greater knowledge and experience and detail orientation than me, weigh in on. But there's also things like specific to when the season is, how many games they play, the fact that where the player salaries are at today means that most of those athletes are not driving home to their 3, 5, 10, $20 million home. Oftentimes, at least today, they're living in team provided housing. And so how do you take something like a quote unquote player lounge, which had kind of become like the de facto, we have to have a player lounge, and actually create spaces within a facility that these athletes feel like they can get away or have some personal time or take a phone call or bring their family in, not just during the regular season, but also in the off season too. And that depends on the market, depends on the team. So I think it's just a much more holistic approach to what the facility means to the athlete, because it can have a much greater impact on, quite frankly, the quality of life for these athletes during the season than, maybe what's more common in some of the counterpart men's leagues, where it's more of a get in, get out type approach, so I think you see that already with what we delivered in Phoenix, and you'll see it on some of the other projects we're working on, where there's just going to be some really unique amenities that aren't just there to catch a headline, but really want to deeply connect with and meet the athlete where they're at, and try to create an environment that they just feel really welcome at, for when they're working really hard and focused on their training, but also maybe when they're trying to take, their mind away from it a little bit.
Yeah. There's also kind of the women's sports fans component too, right? I would imagine the stadiums also have to be designed to fit that profile more, or does it?
Yeah, I mean, the literal example with the KC Currents Stadium, or at least my understanding of it, right, not having worked on it, was, like 2x as many women's bathrooms. It's just like let's look at the data. We have more female fans than maybe the male counterpart league, or let's get specific to our fans, and let's make sure they're provided for. In that one instance, we have not developed a women's specific stadium yet, but I would just say our knowledge and evolving understanding, as these leagues have evolved so quickly, is top of mind with what goes into the design thinking, but then also like just thinking about longevity, what's built to last, what's going to be here to stay for a really long time.
Yeah. It's an interesting discussion with, like, we've had it with our portfolio companies as well, where, they're focused on women's media, right? Women's sports media. And it's like, are we building to serve the athletes and the women's sports teams, or are we building to serve the fans? And the fans can be women's fans that are fans of women's sports or men's sports. So I feel like these lines are blurring, and you're now seeing it probably play out more in like the physical space, while we're having this discussion on the media side as well.
Totally. I completely agree. And that's why it can be kind of a tricky thing to talk about, because I think that question comes up a lot, and everyone's constantly looking for like some unlock or like crazy, how do you like, how do you, it's no knock on your question, because I think it's a fair one, but it's like, how do you serve, the female fan different than the fan of an NBA? It's like, well, I think there's a lot of women who love the NBA, and there's also a lot of men who love the WNBA. And so That's why I unfortunately have to use like the very kind of sterile and boring example of bathrooms, because that's like a literal count thing. But yeah, it'll be exciting to see how that evolves. And I think generally I'm just more excited to see, I think the coolest thing about the KC Current Stadium is it's their home, and so to have that home, not just feel like you're playing in someone else's arena or building, but to really have that home and that identity. That to me is what's most special about having a women's led stadium or venue.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see if, do you watch Ted Lasso?
Yeah, I definitely watched the first couple seasons.
Yeah, I'm going to see what this, if they're actually doing any cameo in the stadium. Would be fun. Zooming a little bit back out at kind of the stadium, the build side, what are some new innovations in stadiums and arena, and both from management and fan side, that you're excited about?
Well, there's what I'm excited about, and then I think there's what you're seeing a lot of. Like the most obvious example of what's happening, I mentioned earlier, the expansion of premium seating. I think the unfortunate reality of that is you're actually seeing the capacities shrink because they're upping the premium. But then when you think about it just purely from a construction cost standpoint, to add additional seating, I should say, the more seating you add, the more expensive per seat those seats are, because of the structure that's needed, like the literal structure to support another ring of a stadium.
Yeah.
So even though you're adding arguably the worst seat in the house, it's actually way more expensive than a seat that is in like the 100 level. So because things have shifted into more and more private dollars supporting these stadiums and financing them, you do have that private investment mindset of how are we optimizing every dollar we're putting into this venue. So I think on the one hand, that's not ideal from an accessibility standpoint. On the other hand, you've got new technology that's out there. So we're working with Cosm on a few select markets for their expansion. And if you're familiar with that, it's this whole shared reality experience.
It's amazing.
Almost 1,000 seats where you feel like you're actually at the event. There's new technology like that that's actually like democratizing in a way, the ability to go and experience your favorite team with other people. You also have some of these incredible premium type experiences, which I know not everyone gets to experience, but at the stadiums, which is encouraging, people to stay at the stadium longer, have a deeper connection with the team. So more premium, challenge on capacity. So maybe smaller capacities, new technologies outside of the stadium environments. But technology is another huge one within the stadium itself. I mean, how many articles were there written about the Ring LED screen at the Intuit Dome, or similarly like what they did at SoFi? I think we finally hit kind of this breaking point where LED technology has gotten affordable enough from a cost standpoint where maybe in 5 years it's not going to be completely obsolete. For a while there, even 10, 15 years ago, you would maybe buy LED and then 5 years later it's obsolete. But now you can buy it and it can last longer. It's much more durable. It's easier to swap out panels. And so as a result, everything's LED. There's banners on every level. There's bigger and bigger boards. So that kind of creates some interesting things from a sponsorship standpoint. It creates interesting things from shoulder programming for these venues, whether it be like movie screenings or concerts and how they integrate. And I think generally, maybe the last thing on this long answer is the desire to do multiple types of events. So we talked about earlier how basically all the new NFL size stadiums that are coming online, other than Buffalo, which I'm happily supporting as a New York taxpayer, but will have domes, and as a result, that's very much driven by the economics you can get through concerts and Final Fours and other events.
Yeah. Yeah, you touch on the tax part, which is also pretty interesting at the fundamental, but also perhaps philosophical in a way of taxpayers are funding some of these development, but you're also bringing in private capital. Then there's this seesaw, as you mentioned, in terms of, how do you provide that experience, make a return, but also make sure that if it's tax funding it, local fans have access to it. And I can see things like COSM being a solution or an intermediate step. But how do people balance that ticket price versus, making it accessible and making a return? I feel like everyone's probably wrestling with this, right?
I mean, it's a hot button topic. It always has been.
Yeah.
Like I said before, every market's different. I think you have to think about the impact of a team and a venue beyond the venue itself. And that's probably a very political answer, but without a doubt, the energy and the attention that the Oklahoma City Thunder were able to draw to that city and that community through their run in the finals this past year is unmatched to maybe anything else that could that those people could express. And like I have family from Oklahoma City. It's a very deeply personal thing that before the Thunder existed, the number one word association with Oklahoma City was bombing. And so does that mean, taxpayers need to be on the hook for every dollar of an arena? I don't know. I don't really want to opine on that. I think, it went up for a vote and there was such clear, strong support for their new arena. And I think a market like Oklahoma City, where there's one professional sports team, at least right now, I think, they're going to get a USL team, is a lot different than, you look at LA, where SoFi Stadium was completely privately financed. And the economics back it up because it's LA, you have the audience, and you can both draw people into the stadium and, you get that reach through media and other revenue streams. So I think it is constantly evolving. I think it comes down to the people of a given market, comes down to the local stakeholders. And I don't think it'll ever get to a point where every stadium deal is the exact same. I will say one thing you're seeing is teams have gotten more savvy at trying to look within their own market about what other opportunities might be in other submarkets. I mean, again, we keep talking about the Battery and the Braves. It was a really hard decision for them to ultimately move to Cobb County, but they're still within Atlanta, and they've done incredibly well out there. And Atlanta loves that team, and they won a World Series. So, yeah, it's a really complicated topic.
Yeah.
It has a lot of different layers to it. And at the end of the day, that's why public officials get elected. It's why things go up for a vote, or it's why things get approved. And it's got to be up to those people to ultimately determine what's best for their city, and how important a team asset or a civic center is, to their city.
Yeah. No, it's clearly, I mean, throughout this conversation, it's very clear that there are a lot of nuances and very market specific. And it's fascinating to kind of even just realizing how complex it is to put a project together. Maybe to wrap things up, because I know we're coming up. Biggest misconception. What do people come to you with in terms of misconception? And you're like, I see this over and over.
I think in the simplest terms, it's that idea of, oh, this place must make so much money, or oh, this place would totally kill it with, their Battery or their mixed use development. Those deals are so complex. There's so much risk associated with them. and they take a lot of time. So there's not really, you nailed it. There's not any straight line to development, no matter how great a market is or a sub-market, no matter how well a team performs. There's so many layers to that, and then ultimately how you balance the team's objectives, ownership's objectives, with what you might need to satisfy from capital or other partners. So I like complexity. We run at it. I think that's why I found myself in this space, and I'm really excited to with what we're working on and also what's to come.
Yeah, amazing. I look forward to the two announcements that are coming out on the women's sports side.
Yeah, sorry to be so mysterious. It'll be here shortly.
Yeah, I'm gonna go dig now. But Tim, if people want to follow your work, get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, I'm pretty basic. Follow me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best source where I post things the most, and I'll be posting more on there. I do have a Twitter account. I don't really post much. I use it more as, I guess it's X, but I use it more as a news aggregator. That's, the last time I posted was probably when it was still called Twitter, but I do use it for a lot of news aggregation and kind of keeping up on the industry. So, and I think that's just at Tim_Katt, but
okay. We'll put it in the show notes.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been enlightening for me. So
yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Pundit podcast, kindly produced by the amazing team at O6. I'll include more information about the guests and the topics covered in the show notes. Head to sportspundit.co to find previous editions, access the newsletter, and to sign up for our WhatsApp group and see upcoming social events in cities around the world. See you again soon.